More than 2 years after a child's life was taken in broad daylight, a UK courtroom has delivered a verdict that brings legal clarity to one of the country's most harrowing cases. A jury has found Skebas guilty of murder in the killing of Lilia Valutyte, a 9-year-old girl who was fatally stabbed while playing near her home in Boston. The decision follows a long and complex trial process in which the defendant had previously denied responsibility. Lilia's death in 2022 sent shockwaves across the UK. Tributes flooded in from around the world as communities struggled to comprehend how a child could be attacked in a familiar residential area in the middle of the day. The case quickly became emblematic of public fears around random violence and the vulnerability of children in public spaces. The verdict came after a trial that forced a nation to confront one of its most unsettling realities: that a child can be taken in an instant, in a place meant to feel safe. In a UK court, a jury has found Skebas guilty of the murder of Lilia Valutyte, a 9-year-old girl whose death in 2022 shook communities far beyond the streets of Boston. For more than 2 years, Lilia's name has been associated with grief, unanswered questions, and a long legal wait. The guilty verdict now brings legal clarity to the case, though it cannot soften the loss felt by her family or erase the images that remain etched in public memory. Sentencing is scheduled for later this month, marking the final stage of a process that has been as emotionally heavy as it has been legally complex. On the day Lilia was killed, she had been playing near her home in a quiet residential area of Boston. It was daytime. Neighbors were nearby. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. Yet within moments, her life was taken in a violent attack that left the country stunned. Emergency services were called, police sealed off streets, and a town struggled to understand how something so horrific could happen so quickly. The investigation that followed was immediate and intense. Lincolnshire Police launched a murder inquiry, appealing for witnesses and reviewing CCTV footage from surrounding streets. Officers worked to reconstruct Lilia's final movements and identify who had been in the area at the time. What emerged was a case built on forensic evidence, surveillance material, and careful analysis of timelines. The accused initially denied murder charges, and the case moved slowly through the justice system. Delays, procedural steps, and the complexity of evidence meant that the trial process stretched over a long period. For the public, that wait was difficult. For Lilia's family, it was unbearable. Each court appearance reopened wounds, while the absence of a verdict left questions hanging in the air. During the trial, prosecutors laid out their case methodically. Jurors heard how the attack unfolded and how investigators linked the defendant to the crime. Evidence presented in court aimed to establish not only that Lilia was unlawfully killed, but that the accused was responsible beyond reasonable doubt. The defense challenged those conclusions, as is required in a criminal trial, testing the strength of the prosecution's narrative and the interpretation of evidence. The jury's guilty verdict confirms which account they ultimately accepted. It represents the legal system's conclusion after weighing all admissible evidence and arguments. In UK law, such a verdict is not reached lightly. Jurors are repeatedly reminded of the seriousness of their task, particularly in cases involving the death of a child. The decision signals that they were satisfied the prosecution met the highest standard of proof. For Lilia's family, the verdict is a moment of painful validation. It acknowledges, formally and publicly, that a crime was committed and that responsibility has been assigned. Family members have spoken previously about their devastation, describing Lilia as a joyful child whose life was full of promise. That promise was cut short in a way that continues to haunt those who followed the case. The impact of Lilia's death extended far beyond her immediate family. In the days after the killing, tributes appeared across Boston and across the UK. Flowers, toys, and handwritten messages lined streets and public spaces. Vigils were held. Strangers mourned alongside neighbors. The case became a symbol of collective grief and fear, particularly around the safety of children in public places. Throughout the trial, the court took care to manage that emotion. Reporting restrictions, careful language, and procedural safeguards were all used to ensure the process remained fair and focused on evidence rather than outrage. Judges repeatedly emphasized that public feeling, however understandable, could not influence the legal determination of guilt. The guilty verdict does not mark the end of the legal process. Sentencing remains ahead, and with it, a renewed examination of the harm caused. In murder cases involving children, sentencing hearings are especially significant. Judges consider the severity of the crime, the the circumstances of the attack, and the broader impact on victims' families and the community. In the UK, such cases often result in life sentences, with minimum terms reflecting the gravity of the offense. Legal experts note that sentencing also serves a communicative function. It explains how the law responds to extreme violence, particularly against the most vulnerable. While punishment cannot restore what was lost, it establishes boundaries and consequences that society deems essential. The case has also reignited national conversations about public safety, mental health, and the prevention of violent crime. While no single case can represent all risks, Lilia's death forced uncomfortable questions into the open. How safe are children in familiar spaces? What warning signs are missed? How should communities and institutions respond to prevent such tragedies? Police and policymakers have been cautious in drawing broad conclusions from the case. They stress that serious violence against children by strangers remains rare. At the same time, they acknowledge that rarity offers little comfort when it does occur. The challenge lies in balancing reassurance with honesty and prevention with realism. For the town of Boston, the case has left a lasting imprint. Even as daily life continues, the memory of what happened remains close to the surface. Residents speak of heightened awareness, of watching children more closely, of streets that feel changed. Over time, physical reminders fade, but collective memory does not. The justice system's response, culminating in the guilty verdict, is part of how societies process such trauma. Trials do not heal grief, but they provide structure, accountability, and an official record of truth as determined by law. That record matters, not only for the family, but for public confidence in justice itself. As sentencing approaches, attention will once again turn to the courtroom. Judges will articulate the reasoning behind the punishment imposed, grounding it in statute and precedent. Those words will become part of the case's legacy, shaping how it is remembered legally and historically. What remains constant throughout is Lilia Valutyte herself. Beyond headlines and court documents, she was a child, 9 years old, playing near her home, unaware that her life was about to end. Remembering that human reality is essential, even as legal processes move forward. The verdict answers the law's central question: who is responsible for Lilia's death? It does not answer the deeper questions that follow every such tragedy. Why did this happen? Could it have been prevented? How does a community live with the knowledge that it did? Those questions linger, even as the case enters its final stage. The guilty verdict is a conclusion, but not an ending. It is a moment of accountability within a much longer story of loss, memory, and the enduring effort to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As the trial concluded and the jury delivered its verdict, attention shifted from the question of guilt to the wider implications of the case. How the investigation unfolded, what the court examined, and why the process took as long as it did. In cases involving the murder of a child, the public often expects swift resolution. The reality is far more complex, shaped by evidentiary standards, procedural safeguards, and the obligation to ensure that any verdict can withstand scrutiny. From the earliest hours after Lilia Valutyte was killed, investigators worked under extraordinary pressure. The crime occurred in daylight, in a residential area where neighbors, passers-by, and potential witnesses were present. That visibility can be a double-edged sword. While it increases the likelihood of evidence, it also introduces noise, conflicting accounts, partial recollections, and the risk of assumptions hardening before facts are established. Detectives focused on reconstructing Lilia's final moments with precision. CCTV footage from nearby streets and businesses was gathered and synchronized, allowing officers to trace movements in the area before and after the attack. Forensic analysis examined the scene, clothing, and any recovered items, seeking links that could place a suspect at the center of events. Each step required care. Contamination or misinterpretation could undermine the entire case. Throughout the investigation, Lincolnshire Police emphasized restraint in public communication. Details were released sparingly, both to protect the integrity of the inquiry and to avoid prejudicing future proceedings. This caution sometimes frustrated observers eager for answers, but it reflected a legal necessity. High-profile cases can collapse if investigators speak too freely or appear to steer public opinion. The accused initially denied murder charges, a position that shaped the course of the trial. Denials require the prosecution to prove every element of the offense beyond reasonable doubt, leaving no gaps that could be exploited by the defense. In practical terms, that meant corroborating evidence from multiple sources rather than relying on a single narrative strand. During the trial, jurors were guided through this evidentiary mosaic. They heard how timelines were constructed, how forensic findings were interpreted, and how investigators eliminated alternative explanations. Defense counsel challenged these interpretations, questioning reliability and consistency. This adversarial exchange is central to the UK criminal justice system. It is how evidence is tested rather than assumed. The length of the process, spanning more than 2 years, has been a point of reflection. For families, time compounds grief. For the justice system, time is the cost of thoroughness. Courts must balance the urgency of accountability with the necessity of fairness. In child murder cases especially, the consequences of error are profound. A rushed verdict risks injustice. A careful one seeks legitimacy. Public reaction to the verdict has been marked by a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the legal question has been answered. Sorrow that the answer confirms an irreversible loss. Vigils and memorials have continued in Boston, not as protests, but as acts of remembrance. These gatherings underscore a truth often repeated in courtrooms. Verdicts close cases, not wounds. The case has also reignited debate about public safety and the protection of children in everyday spaces. While authorities stress that such attacks are rare, rarity offers little comfort when tragedy strikes. Community leaders have called for sustained investment in prevention, better mental health support, attentive community policing, and vigilance without fear. The challenge lies in translating grief into constructive action without fostering panic. Legal experts note that the guilty verdict carries significance beyond this case. It reaffirms the jury's role as the cornerstone of criminal justice, particularly in emotionally charged trials. Jurors are asked to set aside headlines and emotion, focusing solely on evidence and law. Their decision here reflects confidence that the system, though slow, can deliver clarity even in the most difficult circumstances. As sentencing approaches, the court will once again become the focal point. Judges will consider the seriousness of the offense, aggravating factors, and statutory guidelines. In the UK, the murder of a child typically results in a life sentence, with a minimum term set to reflect culpability and harm. These decisions are articulated publicly, explaining how punishment aligns with legal principles. For Lilia's family, sentencing represents another painful milestone. It is an opportunity for the court to acknowledge harm formally, but it also revisits the events they have endured. Support services remain crucial at this stage, as legal finality can coincide with emotional exhaustion. The broader legacy of the case is still forming. Schools, local councils, and community groups have reflected on how to support children and families in the aftermath of violence. Conversations about safeguarding, awareness, and collective responsibility have gained urgency. While no measure can guarantee prevention, the aim is to reduce risk through attention and care. As the legal process continues toward its final step, one reality remains unchanged. A child's life was taken, and a community was altered. The guilty verdict establishes responsibility, but it does not resolve the deeper questions that follow such loss. Those questions, about safety, prevention, and memory, will persist long after sentencing. What the justice system offers, at its best, is a framework for truth and accountability. In this case, that framework has delivered a verdict grounded in evidence and process. The responsibility now is to carry forward the lessons learned, honor the life that was lost, and ensure that remembrance is paired with resolve. As the case moves towards sentencing, the focus shifts once again, from the mechanics of investigation and trial to the broader weight of consequence. A guilty verdict establishes responsibility in law, but sentencing defines how that responsibility is expressed. In cases involving the murder of a child, this stage carries exceptional gravity, not only because of the severity of the crime, but because of what the court must acknowledge about harm, vulnerability, and societal values. The killing of Lilia Valutyte was not just an isolated act of violence. It was an event that disrupted a community's sense of safety in a profound way. Children playing outside, neighbors moving through familiar streets, parents trusting that daylight and proximity offered protection, those assumptions were shaken. Courts cannot restore that sense of safety, but sentencing is one of the ways the justice system signals how seriously such harm is regarded. Judges in the UK operate within clear statutory frameworks when sentencing for murder. A life sentence is mandatory, but the minimum term, the period that must be served before parole can be considered, is set by the court. In determining that minimum term, judges assess aggravating and mitigating factors, guided by law and precedent. The age of the victim, the nature of the attack, and the circumstances in which it occurred are central considerations. In this case, the victim's age alone places the offense at the most serious end of the spectrum. Courts consistently recognize that children are uniquely vulnerable, and that crimes against them represent an extreme breach of social and moral boundaries. The setting, an everyday residential area in broad daylight, further reinforces that seriousness, as it highlights the unpredictability and impact of the violence. Victim impact statements, while not evidence of guilt, play an important role at sentencing. They allow the court to hear directly from those left behind about how the crime has affected their lives. For families, these statements can be both empowering and exhausting. They provide a chance to speak in their own words, but they also require revisiting painful memories. Judges listen carefully, not to decide facts, but to understand the human consequences of what has already been proven. For Lilia's family, the sentencing phase represents another public moment in a journey that has been intensely private and deeply traumatic. Their grief has been visible in tributes, vigils, and statements over the years. Yet much of their experience has unfolded away from cameras and headlines, in daily absences, in unanswered questions, in the quiet weight of loss. The legal system acknowledges this pain without claiming to resolve it. Sentencing remarks often include formal recognition of loss, naming the victim and the impact of their death, ensuring that communities remain attentive and supportive without retreating into isolation or suspicion. From a policing perspective, the case has underscored the importance of rapid response and evidence preservation. Lincolnshire Police moved quickly in the immediate aftermath, securing scenes, collecting forensic material, and appealing for information. While the trial process took time, the investigative foundation was critical in sustaining the case through scrutiny. Legal analysts have pointed out that the jury's guilty verdict reflects confidence in that investigative work. Jurors are instructed to assess evidence carefully, and in emotionally charged cases, they are repeatedly reminded to set aside sympathy or anger. That they reached a guilty verdict indicates that the prosecution's case met the demanding standard required. At the same time, the defense's role remains essential to understanding the outcome. By challenging evidence and testing interpretations, defense counsel helps ensure that verdicts are robust. A conviction reached after rigorous challenge carries greater legitimacy than one achieved without scrutiny. This adversarial process, though painful for those affected, is fundamental to justice. As sentencing approaches, public attention often intensifies once more. There is a natural desire to see punishment reflect the seriousness of the crime. Courts must navigate that expectation carefully, grounding decisions in law rather than emotion. Judges explain their reasoning in detail, outlining how factors were weighed and why a particular minimum term was set. These explanations serve multiple purposes. They inform the family, reassure the public that the case was treated with seriousness, and provide guidance for future cases. Sentencing remarks are studied by lawyers, referenced by judges, and cited in legal analysis. They become part of how the justice system evolves. For many observers, the case has become emblematic of the tension between rarity and impact. While such crimes are uncommon, their consequences are immense. Policymakers and practitioners face the challenge of responding proportionately, strengthening safeguarding and support systems without fostering fear or misdirected policy. Advocacy groups have used the case to highlight the importance of early intervention and community awareness. While no system can prevent every act of violence, patterns often emerge in hindsight. The hope is that by learning from such tragedies, risks can be reduced elsewhere. As the legal process continues, it is important to recognize what sentencing can and cannot do. It can impose punishment, articulate condemnation, and affirm values. These explanations serve multiple purposes. They inform the family, reassure the public that the case was treated with seriousness, and provide guidance for future cases. Sentencing remarks are studied by lawyers, referenced by judges, and cited in legal analysis. They become part of how the justice system evolves. For many observers, the case has become emblematic of the tension between rarity and impact. While such crimes are uncommon, their consequences are immense. Policymakers and practitioners face the challenge of responding proportionately, strengthening safeguarding and support systems without fostering fear or misdirected policy. Advocacy groups have used the case to highlight the importance of early intervention and community awareness. While no system can prevent every act of violence, patterns often emerge in hindsight. The hope is that by learning from such tragedies, risks can be reduced elsewhere. As the legal process continues, it is important to recognize what sentencing can and cannot do. It can impose punishment, articulate condemnation, and affirm values. It cannot bring back a child, erase trauma, or fully restore trust. Expecting more of it risks disappointment. Expecting less risks cynicism. For Lilia Valutyte, the sentencing hearing will mark the final formal chapter in the court process. Her name will be spoken again in a courtroom, not as part of a question about guilt, but as the center of a statement about consequence. That moment carries symbolic weight, even as it cannot change reality. The case will then move into history, recorded in judgments, referenced in discussions, remembered in communities. Over time, new cases will take public attention. For those directly affected, the story will remain immediate and personal. What endures is the reminder at the heart of this case, that the safety of children is a shared responsibility, that violence leaves lasting scars beyond its immediate victims, and that justice, while necessary, is only one part of how societies respond to loss. As sentencing approaches, the focus is no longer on proving what happened, but on acknowledging its impact. The law prepares to speak one last time in this case, not to ask questions, but to state consequences. And in doing so, it affirms a principle that remains central, even amid tragedy, that the lives of children matter, and that their loss demands the most serious response the law can offer. As the case reaches its final legal moment, the meaning of the verdict settles into something quieter and heavier than headlines can convey. The court has determined responsibility for the murder of Lilia Valutyte,